Right. Tonight we'll be discussing the subject of keeping the Sabbath. And I know for a lot of people this is a pretty weird topic to discuss because, as many people who profess Christianity, this is a mute subject, something that they normally don't even talk about. They've probably been told that this is part of the old law system and something that they don't have to consider. And they'll have to observe. But I kind of beg to differ as I've been researching this topic. So what we're going to do is consider that this afternoon, and we're going to go into the subject of keeping the Sabbath. Now, I have here notes that I actually put together pertaining to this topic, and I'll just kind of flow through my notes here. In the introduction part, it says, in exploring this topic, we should first understand how mainstream Christianity views this subject. On the website, godquestions.org, the question is asked, does God require Sabbath keeping of Christians? The argument given lists Acts 15, 19, and 20 as the only requirement from the Torah, which is the law, that Christians were required to keep. The verse reads, wherefore my judgment is that we trouble not them that from among the Gentiles turn to God, but that we write unto them that they abstain from the pollution of idols, and from fornication, and from what is strangled, and from blood. And this is out of the Authorized Standard Version of the Bible. So we examine each of these prohibitions to understand why they were listed by the council in Jerusalem. The first one being things polluted by idols. Now Yahuwah, which is the name of the Father, forbade his people from sacrificing to other mighty ones or gods and eating that which was sacrificed to them, as Exodus 34:14 and 15 states. For thou shalt worship no other God, for Jehovah, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot after their gods, and sacrifice unto their gods, and one call thee, and thou eat of his sacrifice. And this is out of the Authorized Standard Version also. So the verse here says that you are not to eat what was sacrificed unto their gods. And so again, we're talking about things polluted by idols, and the Old Testament in Exodus 34:14 and 15 outlines that. It's one of the prohibitions that Yah's people had to adhere to. And as we go into the history of the surrounding nations, the customs of the people, we come to understand why. These points I gleaned from an AI chat service. The first topic is idol sacrifice and meat sales. In ancient Greece, idol sacrifice was a crucial aspect of religious rituals, particularly in polytheistic cities like Athens and Corinth. Sacrifices were offered to appease and honor the gods, ensuring their favor and protection. In ancient Rome, idol sacrifice was also a central aspect of religious rituals, particularly in public temples and shrines. Roman sacrifices often involved more elaborate and expensive offerings, such as cattle and pigs, which was burnt as part of the ritual. Sacrificing animals to false gods exposed Elohim's people to impure or contaminated worship that could stumble or defile the conscience of a believer in Yahuwah if they knew that the meat was offered to false gods. Elohim's people were to be set apart as the holy possession of Yahuwah. The second point in the Jerusalem Council was to abstain from sexual immorality. As for abstaining from sexual immorality, the pagans worshipped their gods often with sexual demonstrations in honor of their gods. This was prohibited in the worship of Yahuwah, as Deuteronomy 23:17-18 states. There shall be no prostitute of the daughters of Israel, neither shall there be a sodomite, which is a homosexual, of the sons of Israel. Thou shalt not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of Jehovah thy God for any vow, for even both these are an abomination unto Jehovah thy God. And this is out of the ASV version. The AI-generated source provides more information on the subject. Ancient pagan sex rituals. Ancient pagan sexual festivals were an integral part of many pre-Christian cultures, often tied to agricultural cycles, seasonal changes, and mythological narratives. These festivals celebrate the sacred union of humans and nature, acknowledging the life-giving power of sexuality and fertility. Ancient pagan festival prostitution role. Based on the provided search results, sacred prostitution played a significant role in ancient pagan festivals, particularly in Mesopotamia and ancient Greece. Here's a breakdown of its role and perception. In Mesopotamia, sacred prostitution was associated with the worship of Inanna, Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love, fertility, and more. People priestesses, acting as representatives of the goddess, engage in ritual sex with male visitors to the temple, releasing divine fertility energy and ensuring good crops and productive herds. This practice was seen as a religious act of devotion to the goddess rather than mere prostitution. The sacred marriage ritual, where the high priestess and a high priest or king role-played the fertility god Dumuzi, was a key aspect of fertility rites. In ancient Greece, in Corinth, sacred prostitutes were dedicated to the worship of Aphrodite, with some accounts suggesting that they were forced to act as prostitutes for the goddess. The Propoetites, Cypriot women were said to have been forced to engage in sexual activities as surrogates for Aphrodite, generating fertility for Cyprus. The annual festival in Cyprus involved performing sexual activities for Aphrodite herself. However, some scholars question the historical accuracy of these accounts, citing potential misunderstandings and exaggerations. The next point is abstaining from things strangled. The prohibition on eating things that are torn or strangled was designed to keep God's people consecrated, set apart from the nations, making them a holy people. This is seen in these verses. In Exodus 22:31, we read, "You shall be consecrated to me. Therefore, you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beast in the field. You shall not throw it, you shall throw it to the dogs." In Leviticus 7:24, it reads, the fat of an animal that dies of itself and the fat of one that is torn by beasts may be put to any other use, but on no account shall you eat it. In Leviticus 17:15, we read, "And every person who eats what dies of itself or what is torn by beast, whether he is a native or a sojourner, shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Then he shall be clean." Leviticus 22:8 states, "That which dieth of itself or is torn of beast, he shall not eat, to defile himself therewith. I am Jehovah." And Ezekiel 4:14 says, "Then say I, Lord Jehovah, behold, my soul hath not been polluted, for from my youth up, even till now, have I not eaten that which dieth of itself or is torn of beast, neither came there abominable flesh into my mouth." So we can see from these verses that to eat something that was torn was prohibited. It was something that was not to be done by Yah's people. So according to the AI, here's some background and significance of eating strangled animals. In the biblical context, strangled animals refer to those killed without proper slaughter, leaving the blood still within the meat. This practice was common in ancient Rome and other non-Jewish cultures. Food safety and respect for life. Some interpretations suggest that the prohibition against eating strangled animals was also motivated by concerns for food safety. Meat from animals killed swiftly and bled properly was considered safer to consume, as it was less likely to spoil or harbor disease. In contrast, meat from strangled animals may have been more prone to spoilage and contamination. Respect for life and the sanctity of blood. The biblical emphasis on avoiding blood and strangled animals may also be seen as a reflection of the sacredness of life and the importance of treating animals with respect. The phrase, "the life is in the blood," Leviticus 17:11, underscores the significance of blood as a symbol of life and vitality. By avoiding blood and strangled animals, believers demonstrated their reverence for life and commitment to living according to God's will. The next point we have is abstain from blood. The prohibition on eating blood is found in Leviticus 17:14, which states, "For as the life of all flesh, the blood thereof is all one with the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all flesh is the blood thereof. Whosoever eateth it shall be cut off." That's the ASV version. Consuming the flesh and blood of mankind has been and continued to be what is practiced by pagans and those not holding to the faith and worship of Yahuwah. To show the pagan roots of eating blood, this AI-generated source was found on the internet. Pagan blood consumption practices. Pagan blood eating, also known as anthropophagy or blood sacrifice, was a common practice in ancient pagan societies and cultures. This ritualistic consumption of blood was often associated with religious ceremonies, sacrifices, and communal feasting. Ancient Germanic paganism. In Germanic paganism, blood eating was a central ritual in Old Nordic religion, as described in Old Norse sources. The ceremony, known as blot, involved the killing and offering of an animal, followed by communal cooking and eating of its meat. This practice was intimately connected with various aspects of life, including fertility, prosperity, and community bonding. Pagan roots of eating blood. The practice of eating blood has its roots in ancient pagan societies and cultures. According to Burns, the use of blood was common among the Gentiles, who drank it often as sacrifices and in making covenants. Mindful of that, covenants or pacts. Think about that, or oaths, or blood pacts or blood covenants. Similarly, Elakot notes that dishes were sometimes consecrated with blood in pagan rituals. As you can see, it's important for the apostles in Jerusalem to give instructions to the newly converted Gentiles about these things, since the practices were common among their people. This explicit prohibition was not to exclude the other laws in the Torah, but to ensure that paganism would not be tolerated in the worship of Elohim. The website also states, and that's the Got Questions website, it states, "It is inconceivable that the apostles would neglect to include Sabbath keeping if it was God's command for Christians to observe the Sabbath day. But is such a view reasonable? The sins mentioned were a necessary precaution considering the practices of the pagan nations concerning sexual relations, blood, sacrifices, and eating torn animals. Though other laws like not worshiping other gods, bearing false witness, murder, and stealing were not mentioned, it does not preclude them from being followed. With that in mind, we'll look at the Sabbath and determine if worshipers of Elohim are required to keep it. The beginning of keeping the Sabbath. We see the first occurrence of a Sabbath in the creation process found in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. And God had finished on the seventh day his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because that on it he rested from all his work which God had created in making it. For Elohim, the seventh day was to be hallowed or made holy, for it was to signify a day of rest from your labor and a day of spiritual reflection. The spiritual reflection is what made the day holy or hallowed. When Elohim delivered his people from Egyptian bondage, he caused them to journey in the desert and wrote to the land he had promised their forefather Abraham. He provided food and water for them on their journey. He caused manna, which is a flaky bread-like substance, to fall from heaven, and provided water from a rock to quench their thirst. The occurrence with the manna is provided at Exodus chapter 16, verses 22 through 30. The people were to gather twice as much manna on the sixth day, because on the seventh day they could do no work of gathering, but was to rest on that day. And verse 23 states, and he, Moses, said unto them, this is what Jehovah has spoken. Tomorrow is a solemn rest, a holy Sabbath unto Jehovah. Bake that which ye will bake, and boil that which ye will boil, and all that remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until morning. So they were just to collect what they were to collect 6 days, but they were to collect double on that sixth day, because on the seventh day they couldn't go out and collect. And Moses told them that if they tried to collect it, it would be spoiled. It would be full of worms. So some of them did, and it spoiled, just as Moses says. So this was a weekly Sabbath, and when the people went out on the seventh day, as I just mentioned, to gather manna in disobedience to Elohim's command, Yahuwah said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? Yahuwah would later codify his law concerning keeping the Sabbath day holy for man, beast, and the land. So, for man and beast, no work was to be done on the Sabbath. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11 states the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments. And we're to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And the scripture states, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to Yahuwah your Elohim, and you should do no work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahuwah made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahuwah blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In reiterating the importance of keeping the Sabbath, Elohim told Moses at Exodus 31, 13 through 17, and you speak to the sons of Yisrael, saying, you shall surely keep my Sabbaths. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahuwah who sanctifies you. And you shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days work may be done, But on the seventh day, there is a Shabbat of complete rest, holy unto Yahuwah. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel shall keep the Shabbat, to celebrate the Shabbat throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For 6 days Yahuwah made heavens and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased and was refreshed. Or sometimes I may interchange the word Sabbath for Sabbath, but it means the same thing. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3. For in 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day there is a Shabbat of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Shabbat to Yahuwah in all your dwellings. In reiterating the Ten Commandments, Moses adds additional information pertaining to keeping the Sabbath by the sojourner in their land and even the animals. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 to 15, it states, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as Yahuwah your El commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahuwah your El. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your cattle or your sojourner, that is inside your gates, so that your male servant and your female servants may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahuwah your El brought you out of there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahuwah your El commanded you to observe the Shabbat day. No loads or burdens were to be carried. The sons of Israel were not to carry any loads or anything that's to be lifted or carried into the city gates or out of their houses on the Sabbath. If they obeyed this commandment, there will always be a king and princess sitting on the throne. It is evident that they did not keep the Sabbath properly, as we see that they don't have one today. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 19 states, thus Yahuwah said to me, go and stand in the gate of the sons of the people, by which the kings of Yehudah, which is Judah, enter in or enter by it, and by which they go out by it, and in all the gates of Jerusalem, which is Jerusalem, and saying to them, listen to the word of Yahuwah, kings of Yehudah, and all the Yehudah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem who come in through these gates. Thus says Yahuwah, take heed for yourself, and do not carry a burden on the Shabbat day, and bring it in through the gates of Jerusalem. You shall not bring a load out of your houses on the Shabbat day, nor do any work, but keep the Shabbat day holy, as I commanded your fathers. Yet they did not listen nor incline their ears, but stiffened their necks, not to listen nor take correction. But it shall come about, if you listen attentively to me, declares Yahuwah, to bring no burden in through the gates of this city on the Shabbat day, but to keep the Shabbat day holy, not to do any work on it. Then there shall come in through the gates of this city kings and princes sitting on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, the men of Yehudah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall be inhabited forever. So there's a promise that if they were to keep the Shabbat or the Sabbath, that they would continue to be blessed with kings and princes that would be able to sit on the throne of David and rule. But again, as we see that this did not occur because they left off his covenant. No fires were to be kindled. The Sabbaths or Shabbats were a sign of the covenant between Yahuwah and the sons of Yisrael for all generations as a perpetual, everlasting covenant. No fires were to be started or kindled on the Sabbath. This calls for no cooking over an open flame on the Sabbath. Cooking was to be done just before the Sabbath began. Exodus 35, 1 through 3. Then Moses, assembled all the congregation of the sons of Yisrael and said to them, these are the things that Yahuwah instructs you to do. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day shall be holy to you, a Shabbat of rest to Yahuwah. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on a Shabbat day. The land was to have a Sabbath rest from producing its fruit. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 through 7. Yahuwah then spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the sons of Yisrael, and say unto them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to Yahuwah. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its produce. But during the 7th year there shall be a Shabbat of rest for the land, a Shabbat to Yahuwah. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. You shall not reap that which grows of itself of your harvest, and the grapes of your untrimmed vines you shall not gather. There shall be a sabbatical year for the land, and the Sabbath of the land shall be to you for food, for yourself, and for your male servant, and for your maidservant, and for your hired man, and for your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you, and to your cattle, and to the animals that are in your land shall have all its produce to eat. When Israel disobeyed this command, Yahuwah brought the Babylonians against them and took them into captivity for 70 years, which equaled the total number of Sabbath years that they did not let the land rest. So for 420 years of their existence as a nation, they failed to let the land rest for 1 year after 6 years of plowing. That just shows how disobedient they were to Yahuwah's Sabbath. They didn't keep it for the land, nor did they fully keep it for themselves. Jeremiah 25:11-13. This whole land shall be a desolation and a horror, for these nations shall serve the king of Babel 70 years. Then it shall be when 70 years are completed, I shall punish the king of Babel and that nation, declares Yahuwah, for their iniquity in the land of the Kasdim, which is the Babylonians, and I shall make it an everlasting desolation. I shall bring upon that land all my words which I have pronounced against it, all that is written in this scroll which Jeremiah has prophesied against all the nations. In 2 Chronicles 36:20-21, we read, and them that are escaped from the sword he carried away to Babel, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Paris, which is Persia, to fulfill the word of Yahuwah by the mouth of Yahu, which is Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbath. All the days of its desolation it kept its Sabbats to fulfill 70 years. So Yahuwah had his people go into Babylonian exile for 70 years, and that made up for the total years that the land should have rested. So if you were to take those 70 years and you were to multiply it out, you have to say for every 6 years, there should have been 1 year of rest for the land. So all you have to do is multiply 6 times 70, and you would get 420 years. And so that's why within that period of time, they didn't let the land rest for that 1 year period. And that's why they went into exile for 70 years, so that the land can rest. So buying and selling was forbidden on the Sabbath or new moon. When Israel was brought back into their land after Babylonian exile, they obligated themselves to keep the law of Yahuwah and to keep the Sabbaths, even the land Sabbath. They were not able to buy or sell on the Sabbath. Yeah. Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 28 to 33 states this. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all those who had separated themselves from the people of the lands through the law of the Elohim, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, all those who had knowledge and understanding, were holding fast with their brothers, their nobles, and entering into a curse and into an oath to walk in Elohim's law, which is given by the hand of Moshe, the Elohim's servant, and to keep and do all the commandments of Yahuwah our master, and his judgments and his statutes, that we shall not give our daughters to the peoples of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land who bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, you shall not buy from them on the Sabbath, or on a holy day, and we shall forego the seventh year, which is the land Sabbath, and the interest of every hand. And we made ordinances for us to change ourselves yearly with a third of a shekel for the service of the house of our El, for the showbread, and for the continual grain offering, for the continual burnt offering, the sabbats, the kodeshim, which are new months, for the appointed times, and for the holy things, and for the sin offerings to make atonement for Yisrael and all the work of the house of our El. So what I'm going to do is to take note of the list of commands that they were willing to obey after being disciplined for their disobedience during their Babylonian captivity. They agreed to walk in Elohim's law, to keep Yahuwah's law, which is Torah. So law means Torah or instruction. They were to keep his commandments, which is the mitzvah, which is a direct order. His judgments, which is a mispah, which is a verdict or form of decree. It's kind of like in court, you get a verdict from the judge. That's what a judgment is. The statutes, which is a hoki, which is a prescribed task or duty one is bound to. So they agreed to keep all that, not to give their daughters to foreigners, and not to accept the sons of foreigners for their daughters. So they were to keep separate. They were not to intermingle or intermarry with other nations, not to buy or sell on the Sabbath or new moon, which is the dark moon, not to plow the fields or to forego the cultivation on the seventh year, which is why they were handed over to Babylon to be captives, and to support the house of Elohim by their voluntary offerings. This all they agreed to do. In Nehemiah 13, 15 through 22, we also read, in those days I saw in Judah, ones who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading on the donkeys, also wine, grapes, figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them on the day in which they sold food. And men of Tyre or Sor were living in it, which was in the land, who imported fish and all wares and sold them to the sons of Yehuda on the Sabbath and in Jerusalem. Then I contended the nobles of Yehuda and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our El brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you will bring more wrath on Yisrael by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and charged that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. And I set some of my servants at the gates so that there should no burden be brought on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and the sellers of all wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them and said to them, why do you lodge in front of the wall? If you do so again, I shall send a hand against you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should be cleansing themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O my El, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your mercy. So Nehemiah was really fighting for the people of Israel to keep the Sabbath, not to buy or sell from the other inhabitants of the land. And he charged the Levites to consecrate themselves so that they can guard the gate and keep this from happening. So we see even after their exile, it's still a fight to have them keep the Sabbath. Amos chapter 8 verses 4 through 10 also states, hear this, you who trample the needy, to do away with the humble of the land, saying, when shall the Kodesh, which is the first day of the month, when shall the Kodesh be gone, so that we may buy grain, and the Sabbath, that we may open the wheat, to make the bushel small, and to enlarge the shekel, and to pervert the balance of deceit, so as to buy the helpless for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, that we may sell the chaff of the wheat. Yahuwah has sworn by the pride of Jacob, or Jacob, surely I shall not forget forever all of their deeds. Because of this, shall not the land quake, and everyone who dwells in it mourn? And all of it shall rise up like the Nile, and it shall overflow and sink like the Nile of Mitzrayim, or Egypt. It shall come about in that day, declares Adonai Yahuwah, that I shall make the sun go down at noon, and I shall darken the earth in the day of light. Then I shall turn your festivals into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation, and I shall bring sackcloth on all loins, and baldness on every head. And I shall make it like the mourning for an only one, and the end of it like a bitter day. So, as I was reading this, I came to understand and thought about it. I heard this before, but part of this prophecy was fulfilled at the death of the Messiah, Yahushua. The day hours ran from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and the night hours from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So darkness covered the land from the 6th hour, which is noon, to the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m., when Yahushua was on the cross. And this is found at Luke 23, 44, and 45. But we did see when that darkness occurred during the middle of the day, as this prophecy stated. And they did mourn as for an only one, or only son, or only child. It was a bitter day. But this was too because they treated the Sabbath and they treated the new moon, or the first day of the month, as being something that was burdensome, because they wanted to be able to buy and sell, and they did it corruptly or deceitfully. But they knew that the law stated that they were not to do this, but they dreaded it. They hated it because they were wicked. But judgment was determined upon Yah's people for profaning his Kodesh, which is a new moon, and Sabbath day. Israel quickly turned aside from the way and the oath they swore, and began to dishonor the Sabbath and the new moon festivals. It's considered the penalty for violating the Sabbath. In Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36, it states, "Now while the sons of Yisrael were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moshe and Aaron and to all the congregation, and he put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then Yahuwah said to Moshe, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as Yahuwah had commanded Moshe." As you can see, Yahuwah is very serious about his people not doing any work on the Sabbath. There was not a slap on the wrist, reprieve, or a second chance for Sabbath breakers. And it was swift punishment. Yahuwah would not honor Sabbaths or festivals done with a disobedient heart. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 9 to 16 states, "Unless Yahuwah of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom. We would be like Gomorrah. Hear the word of Yahuwah, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the law of our El, you people of Gomorrah. To what are the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says Yahuwah? I am full of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle, and I delight not in the blood of bulls, of lambs, or of goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires this at your hand to trample my courts? Do not add to bring vain sacrifice. Incense is an abomination to me. Kodesh, New Moon, and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity in the solemn assembly. I hate your Kodeshim and your appointed feasts, which have become a burden to me. I am weary to bear them. So, when you spread out your hands, I hide my eyes from you. Yes, when you multiply prayers, I shall not listen. Your hands are covered with blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, reprove the oppressed, judge the orphan, defend the widow. Yahuwah was not against the observances that he initiated, but he was against his people celebrating those special observances, which was meant to be performed from a heart of obedience and joy. But they done it with iniquity, bloodstained hands, injustice, and hypocrisy. He didn't want to accept that. Yahuwah would bless his people that keep his Sabbath from the heart. Isaiah 58, verse 13 and 14. If, because of the Sabbath, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of Yahuwah honorable, and honor it, away from doing your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure, and speaking your own word, then you shall take delight in Yahuwah, and I shall make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I shall feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father. For the mouth of Yahuwah has spoken. Man, that's a great promise. Not doing our own thing or our own way of speaking our own word, but if we were to honor his Sabbath, he would bless us. Isaiah 66, 22 and 23 says, for just as the new heavens and the new earth, which I make, shall endure before me, declares Yahuwah, so your offspring and your name shall endure. And it shall be from Kodesh, which is new moon, to Kadesh, from Sabbath to Sabbath. All mankind shall come and bow before me, says Yahuwah. Now we know that that's a promise that hasn't been kept yet. But from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all mankind will come and bow before Yahuwah. So is he still serious about that Sabbath? I think so. Let's consider the new moon cycles. And we see this Rosh Kadesh. Specifically, Rosh Kadesh is the first day of a new month, coinciding with the new moon. If the previous month had 30 days, the preceding month is also considered Rosh Chodesh. This holy day is observed as a minor festival, often marked with special prayers, rituals, and a festive meal. Here's the definition of a new moon. According to various sources, a new moon is the phase of the moon when it is in conjunction with the sun, with its dark side facing the earth. This alignment occurs when the moon is between the earth and the sun, making it invisible to the naked eye, except during a solar eclipse. So it's a dark moon. The original meaning of the term new moon, which is still sometimes used in calendrical, non-astronomical context, is the first visible crescent of the moon after conjunction with the sun. This then waxing crescent is briefly and faintly visible as the moon gets lower in the western sky after sunset. It takes 29.53 days for the moon to complete one cycle. So almost every 30 days you see the cycle. From darkness to light is the cycle of the moon. The 4 quarters of the moon are first the new moon, which is the dark moon, then the first quarter, then a full moon, which is a fully illuminated moon, and then the last quarter. The new moon was the dark moon used to signify the start of religious festivals. And this is shown in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, Isaiah 1:14, and Numbers 28:11 and 10:10. Kadesh, or the new moon, is a monthly cycle or lunar moon, and all the Sabbath days are accounted from the beginning of the lunar cycles. For example, if the new moon starts on a Tuesday, then no work is to be done on this day and is treated as a Sabbath day. Counting 7 days from Tuesday will bring you back to Tuesday, which would be the Sabbath day. Every Tuesday thereafter would be a Sabbath day until the next new moon. So the Sabbath is not every Saturday. The Sabbath occurs with the visibility of the new moon. So that's where the Sabbath day would start on that day. It will actually be the new moon. It will start on that day, and then the come 7 days will be the start of the Sabbath day for that month or that period until the next new moon. So that could fall on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or any other day of the week. So again, it wouldn't necessarily be on a Saturday, as some may have believed. The new moon and Sabbath was a time for worship. The inner temple court was to be closed during the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath and on the new moon it shall be open for worship. In Ezekiel 46:1-3, it says, "Thus says my Adon Yahuwah, the gate of the inner court facing east shall be shut the 6 working days, but it shall be open on the day of Shabbat, and open on the day of the Kodesh. The prince shall enter by way of the porch of the gate from outside and stand by the post of the gate. Then the priest shall provide his burnt offering and his peace offerings, and he shall worship at the threshold of the gate, and then go out. But the gate shall not be shut until the evening. The people of the land shall worship at the doorway of that gate before Yahuwah on the Shabbats and on the Kodeshim." Okay? Also, Yahuwah will bless those of the Gentiles that keep the Sabbath. Now, this is kind of like in response to the GotQuestions.org. Should Christians or those who believe in Yahuwah Elohim, are they required to keep the Sabbath? Listen what Isaiah 56:1-7 says. That says Yahuwah, Preserve justice and do righteousness, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning the Sabbath, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. Let not the son of stranger who has joined himself to Yahuwah speak, saying, Yahuwah shall surely separate me from his people. Nor let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. For thus says Yahuwah to the eunuch, to keep my Sabbaths, and choose what pleases me, and hold fast my covenant. To them I shall give in my house and within my walls a hand, and a name better than that of sons and of daughters. I shall give them an everlasting name, which shall not be cut off. Also, the sons of the stranger who join themselves to Yahuwah, to minister to him, and to love the name of Yahuwah, to be his servants, everyone who keeps from profaning the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I shall bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. In this prophecy, Yahuwah promises to give the eunuch, which is a castrated male, a name that is better than sons. And to the children of strangers, Yahuwah promises to make them joyful while worshiping at his holy mountain and in his house of prayer, if they keep his covenant and not profaning the Sabbath, the Sabbath or Sabbath observances. And this is an observance for all the peoples that come to worship Yahuwah. It is clear from the law or the Torah and the prophets, which is the Old Testament, that keeping the new moon and the Sabbath festivals was an integral part of the worship of Yahuwah. So now as we turn to the time of the Messiah, let's observe how he dealt with the Sabbath and what things he did on the Sabbath. Yahushua taught the people on the Sabbath. Luke chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Yahushua returned to the Galilee, in the power of the Spirit, and the news of him went out in all the plain. He taught in their synagogues, and all of them praised him. He came to Nazareth, where he grew up, and according to his custom, he went to the house of the synagogue on the day of Shabbat and stood up to read the scroll. And in Luke 4:31 says, he came to Capernaum, a town of the Galilee, and he taught them on the Shabbat. So it's clear that Yahushua, which is the Messiah, he used the Shabbat to teach what the Scripture stated. So the Shabbat or the Sabbath was a time of spiritual instruction for the Messiah. Yahushua delivered the people of demonic possession on the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 26, it says, and they went to Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, entering into the synagogue, he was teaching them. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, saying, What have you to do with us, Yahushua of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know you. You are the Holy One of Elohim. And Yahushua rebuked him, saying, Be silent and come out of him. And having convulsed him, the unclean spirit, and having cried out with a loud voice, came out of him. So Yahushua cast out a demon from the man on the Sabbath after teaching the people the Torah. Okay? Again, this is on the Sabbath. Yahushua and his disciples gathered food to eat on the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 12, verses 1 through 36. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. It says, At that time, Yahushua went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Okay? And Frushim, which is the Pharisees, saw this and said to him, Behold, your disciples are doing what is not to be done on a Shabbat. But he said to them, Have you not read what David did when he and his men were hungry, that he entered into the house of the Elohim and ate the bread of the presence, which was not permitted for him and for his men to eat, but for the priest only? Have you not read in the law that on the Shabbats the priests desecrate the Shabbat in the temple, yet they have no iniquity? But I say to you that there is something greater than the temple here. So what does he mean that they profaned or they desecrated the Shabbat? Well, the priests worked on the Shabbats. So that was something that was unlawful for the people to do. But they had to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, so they had to work. They had to kindle a fire on the Shabbat, which was something unlawful for them to do, for the people to do. But they had to do this to offer the sacrifices. So they were able to work and to kindle fires and whatnot on the Shabbat. So, but it was perfectly lawful for them to do that because that was their sacred duty. But that's what he was saying, that something greater than the temple was here. And the Pharisees didn't realize it or recognize it. In Mark chapter 2, verse 27-28 says, He said to them, The Sabbath was given for the sake of man, and not man for the sake of the Shabbat. Therefore, Edom, master, the son of Adam, is even of the Shabbat. So he was basically saying that he, as the son of man or son of Adam, is greater. Okay, he's the master of the Shabbat. And they couldn't understand what this meant, but they would soon. Yahushua healed people on the Sabbath. Mark chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. And they waited in ambush for him if he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him on the words plotted. He said to the man whose hand was withered, Arise and stand in the middle. And he said to them, Is it permitted on the Shabbat to do good or to do harm, to rescue life or to put to death? And they were silent. Then he turned and looked intently at them in anger and was grieved at the hardness of their hearts. And he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched out his hand, and it was healed, and returned to being like the other one. And the Pharisees quickly went out to consult with the men of the Herodians against him to destroy him. Luke chapter 13, verse 10 through 14. And it came to pass that he was teaching on the day of the Shabbat in one of the houses of the synagogue. Behold, a woman in whom there was a spirit of disease for 18 years, and was bent over, and was not able to stand with a straight posture. Yahushua saw and called to her. He said to her, Woman, be free from your disease. He placed his hand upon her, and instantly she arose and stood upright and praised the Elohim. The ruler of the synagogue was indignant that Yahushua had healed on the Shabbat. So he responded and said to the crowd, There are 6 days in which you may do labor. Come and be healed on them, but not on the day of Shabbat. Wow, what hard-heartedness. But he was showing that it was fine to heal on the Shabbat. That's why he did it on that day. Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. It came to pass as he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Shabbat to eat bread. They were waiting in ambush for him. Behold, there was a certain man in front of him whose body was swollen with water. Yahushua answered and said to the sages and to the Pharisees, saying, Is it permitted to heal on the Sabbath or on Shabbat or not? And they were silent. He grasped him and healed him and sent him away. He answered and said to them, Which man of you, if his donkey or his ox fall into a well, would not quickly lift it out on the day of Shabbat? They did not know how to answer him regarding these words. That's because they were hypocrites. There's an account at John chapter 5, verses 1 through 16, where Yahuwah healed a man who was crippled for 38 years at the pool by the sheep gate. And he did this on the Sabbath. And afterwards, the man told the Jews that it was Yahuwah that healed him. The Jewish leaders pursued Yahuwah and sought to kill him because he healed on the Sabbath. Their lack of understanding of the purpose of the Sabbath led to a fanaticism and intolerance of any deed, whether good or bad, performed by the common people. They could, however, save an animal if it fell in a hole on the Sabbath. Well, that's why they were called hypocrites, because they can do it, but the people couldn't. John chapter 7, verses 22 to 24. Moshe gave you circumcision, although it does not come from Moshe, but from the fathers, and even on the day of the Sabbath, every man is to be circumcised. Now, if you shall circumcise the foreskin of a man on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moshe is not violated, why do you get angry at me for healing the entire man on the Sabbath? Do not judge by the appearance of the eye, but judge with correct judgment. See, it was even acceptable to do a medical treatment, such as circumcision on the Sabbath, if it was on the 8th day of a child's life, if it was in keeping with the law. If an act involved healing or restoring or keeping the law, then it was acceptable to do it on the Sabbath. By the way, the commandment to circumcise every male child throughout the generations came from Yahuwah to Abraham, which is found in Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 through 14, if you want to read that on your own. John chapter 9, verses 13. They brought the man who had previously been blind to the Pharisees. The day on which Yahushua had made the clay and opened his eyes, it was on the day of a Shabbat. The Pharisees also asked him once more how his eyes were opened. He said to them, he placed clay on my eyes, and I washed them, and behold, I see. Yahushua was showing that it is good, that to do good to others was acceptable on the Sabbath. That's why he did all his miracles on the Sabbath. Let's look at the Jewish leaders and their customs on the Sabbath. Sabbath day's journey. Matthew chapter 24, verse 20 says, but pray that your flight should not be in the winter nor on a Sabbath. It was supposed that the distance of 2,000 cubits or less than half a mile, the distance to which, according to Jewish tradition, it was allowable to travel on the Sabbath day without violating the law of the Jewish leaders. Just note, there's no law of Moses that sets a limit on the distance one can travel on the Sabbath. As you can see, the Jewish leaders had many laws that restricted any activities on the Sabbath. Here's another, John 19:31. The Yahudim, which are the Jews, said the corpses did not remain on the crucifix on the day of Shabbat, since it was the evening of Shabbat. And that day of Shabbat was significant. So they requested for Pilate to break their legs and take them down. The Jewish leaders did not allow dead men to remain on the cross on the Shabbat, which was a custom not reported in the law of Moses. They made up additional laws respecting the Sabbath, as seen here. Let's move on past the time of the Messiah and go to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, or Saul, taught on the Sabbath, Acts 13:14. But they, passing through Perga, came to Antioch that was in Pisidia, and they went into the house of the synagogue on the day of the Sabbath and sat down. And it came to pass, after the reading of the law and the prophets, Paul, which is Saul, standing up and motioning with his hand, said, men of Israel, and you who fear Elohim, listen. So the point of this is that he did this on the day of Shabbat. Again, he taught the people as the Messiah on the day of Shabbat. Acts 13:42-45. And it came to pass when they went out of the house of the synagogue, they besought from them to be spoken these words to them on the next Shabbat. When the synagogue separated each other from the other, many of the Yahudim and of the righteous proselytes followed after Paul and Barnabas, and that they spoke to their hearts and were urging them to continue in the grace of the Elohim. On the second Shabbat, almost all the city gathered to hear the word of Yahuwah. And it came to pass when the Yahudim saw the crowd of the people, they were filled with jealousy and denied the words of Paul, denying and reproaching. Acts chapter 15, verse 21. From ancient generation has in every city those proclaiming him, since being read in the houses of synagogues from the day of Shabbat to Shabbat. So it was a custom to read the words of Elohim on the Shabbat. Okay? Acts chapter 16, verse 13. And on the day of the Shabbat, we went outside the gate to the side of a river where there were a place of prayer, as was their custom. And having sat down, we were speaking to the women who met there. A woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple, a worshiper of Elohim, was hearing, and Yahuwah opened her heart to listen to the words of Paul. When did he do this? On the day of Shabbat. Acts 18:1-4. And it came to pass after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he was reasoning in the house of the synagogue every Shabbat and convincing Yahudim and Greeks. The Sabbath day was a time of spiritual instruction, and Paul used the Sabbath to teach both Jews and those Hebrews that assimilated due to Hellenization, also known as Greeks. Colossians chapter 2, verses 8, 11, 14, 16, and 17. Beware lest a man shall lead you astray through the philosophies and through vain deceptions according to the traditions of men, according to the elementary matters of the world, and not according to Mashiach, which is the Messiah. And in him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the sinful flesh by the circumcision of Mashiach, blotting out the handwriting that bear witness to us in his ordinances, and he has taken it out of us, having nailed it to the crucifix. Therefore, let no one judge you on the word of food and drink, or an appointed feast, and Rosh Kodesh, which is the head of months, and Sabbath, which are a shadow of the future things to come, but the body is of the Mashiach. So here, the warning was not to go astray by the traditions of the sons of men, which include Halloween, which is pronounced Samhain, Christmas, which is Saturnalia, Easter, which is Oster, which is the goddess of spring and fertility, celebrations that were practiced in many nations but under different names. But as to the traditions instituted by Elohim, let no man judge. That means to pronounce an opinion concerning right or wrong, you concerning food, drink, appointed feast, and celebrating Rosh Kodesh, which is a new moon or Sabbath, which point to Mashiach, who is to fulfill the fullness of these observances. Okay? So Paul's writing is pretty clear that if you were to practice these things, let no man judge you concerning these things. But we are warned against practicing the traditions of men, which we find today in being these so-called holiday celebrations. Scriptures used to persuade Christians not to keep the Sabbath. Now, going back to this article in Got questions.org. These are some of the scriptures that they use to persuade Christians not to keep the Sabbath. They use Romans 14:5, and it says, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The new moon and Sabbath observances were not days that men would esteem, but direct commandments from Elohim that men must observe at the penalty of death. This scripture deals with days that men observe as special, that originate from personal preference. The Sabbath was not some arbitrary day, but a day that Yahuwah Elohim commanded his people to honor and make holy through all their generations. And this is quoted in Exodus 31:13 through 17. The claim is that Christians met on the first day of the week, Sunday, not on Saturday for worship. So this is also claimed in the article that they met on the first day of the week. By our Gregorian calendars, the first day of the week would be Sunday. Okay? So in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, this is what it says in most translations of the Bible. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. Okay. Also in 1 Corinthians 16:2, we read, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. So again, the translators rendered these verses as the first day of the week and the first day of every week. But when we look at the interlinear version of the Bible, we say something completely different. Notice how these verses should be rendered if you view them word for word in the Greek. So you can actually look at this interlinear called online interlinear from Scripture for All. And in Acts 26:7, we see that in the Greek. And the English translation of that is, we yet sail off after the days of the unleavened bread. Philippi and came toward them into the Troas until days 5, where we tarried days 7. And yet the one day of the Sabbaths, having been gathered the disciples of to break bread, the Paul argued to them, being about to be off to the on morrow. He prolonged, besides the word, until midnight. I know it's kind of hard to understand, but we can see that you have two special times here in the Greek that was observed by Yisrael. As mentioned, it's the days of unleavened bread and the Sabbath. You can see that clearly from the Greek, word for word. The translators obfuscate or confuse the understanding of the reader so that one would not see that Paul taught on the Sabbath, as did his Messiah. The second verse used is 1 Corinthians 16:2. Examine that in the Greek first. Word for word, it says, according to one day of Sabbaths, each of you, besides himself, let him be laying store, which any ever may be being prospered, that know whenever I may be coming, then collections may be occurring. So we can see also from this verse that collections were to be taken on the Sabbath from each disciple. So when Paul arrived, those monies will have already been collected. So personally, I like to use the Greek sefer. It's a translation from Greek to English. There's a Hebrew to English version as well as a Greek to English version. But let's notice how those verses are rendered using this Greek sefer. Acts 20. Let me zoom back into that. Acts 20, verse 7. Um, it says, we left from Philippi after the days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and came on the boat to them at Troas at the end of 5 days. And there we stayed 7 days. And it came to pass on one of the Shabbats, or Shabbato, when the disciples were gathered to break bread, Paul spoke to them that he said to go to the following day from there, and he was extending the word until midnight. And then that same version in 1 Corinthians 16:2 says, on one of the Sabbats, each of you, when you reach his hand, he shall leave it to him, and he may prosper, so that there should be no collections again when I come. So we can see again, it was not the first day of the week, but on the Shabbat or on the Sabbath that these two things were done. On the God Questions website, there are several scriptures to promote freedom in Christ, such as Romans 8:21. It says that the creation itself would be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. But what is that corruption that creation would be set free from? Is it the Torah? Of course not. Verse 7 tells us that minding the flesh is enmity with God, for it is not subject to the law or Torah of God. And for this reason, the corruption would have to pertain to sin, introduced through the disobedience of Adam. And another scripture that they used in is 2 Corinthians 3:17, which says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. But freedom from what? Freedom to sin? Freedom from the law of Elohim? Of course not. The freedom in the Spirit that is part of the new covenant is what the written law would be writing, would be the written law written on the hearts of believers, and the sacrificial system that reminded them of their condemnation would be replaced by Yahushua's sacrifice once and for all time, exchanging their sinfulness for his righteousness. And they would be free to do good works for Elohim, which he prepared for them to walk in, according to Ephesians chapter 2, verses 10. So this freedom would be the freedom from, of the new covenant, which the Holy Spirit writes the law of Elohim in their hearts. That's the freedom that we're looking to, and it was spoken about and referenced in 2 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, verse 17, if you look at the context of that. Another scripture is used in Galatians 5:1, which it says, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. The yoke of slavery spoken about in this verse is the doctrine of circumcision, which was not binding on Gentile believers. Paul in Romans chapter 2, verses 25 to 29 was condemning those who boasted in their circumcision, but transgressed the law. And Paul stated in verses 26 and 27 of that chapter, if therefore the uncircumcision keep the requirements of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be reckoned for circumcision? And uncircumcision by nature, fulfilling the law, judge thee, who with letter and circumcision art a law transgressor? The importance is laid on keeping the law of Elohim, not in boasting in one's circumcision. It is evident that the yoke that Paul conveyed to the Gentiles referred to circumcision, not the keeping of the law. So now, in conclusion, our Creator Yahuwah Elohim set the example in resting from his works after 6 days of creative work. When he brought his people out of Egypt, he gave them laws to set them apart from all the nations round about them concerning the Sabbath, or the seventh day, he commanded that his people abstain from work, not kindle a fire, not to carry loads or burdens in or out of their homes, and not to buy or sell during the Sabbath. The animals, as well as any sojourners in their land, were to observe the Sabbath. Even the land was to have a Sabbath year after 6 years of plowing. The Sabbath was to be a time for spiritual reflection, instruction, and good works. We enter into Elohim's rest when we rest of our works. And according to Isaiah 56, the eunuchs and the strangers will receive Yahuwah's blessing if they do not profane his Sabbath. During the time when Yahushua walked the earth, he taught, healed, delivered from demonic oppression, and even gathered food on the Sabbath. He showed others that he was the master of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Even the Apostle Paul kept the Sabbath and appointed feasts, and did all his teaching on the Sabbath, as was the custom. So, should we keep the Sabbath? I believe the scriptures confirm that we should. As Exodus chapter 31, verses 13 says concerning the Sabbath, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahuwah, who sanctifies you, and you shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. I think the evidence is clear. How about you? Thank you for this time. Peace and shalom, my brothers and sisters.